Okay, awesome. Hello, everyone. My name is Kim McQuarrie, the Director of Programming and the Co-Director of the Innovation Labs here at the Dalí Museum. We're so happy that you're back with us for our bi-monthly podcast, Follow the Tangent, Archives, Art, and Anecdotes. During each of these episodes, we really want to dive into the world of art history, thinking about art, archives, research, and focus on the examination of a different aspect of museums, museum studies, and Dalí. In this episode, we're happy to welcome back our favorite scholar, Miguel Escribano, who's going to discuss with us some interesting aspects of Dalínian history, specifically focused on some of Dalí's favorite reading. So welcome back to the podcast, Miguel.
Thank you very much. Nice to be back with you.
Yeah. So one of the well-known facts from Dalí's early artistic biography was his collection of this little set of books, which were about certain painters and were published by, I think it was a father and son team named Gowans. And before we get to Dalí's own set, I wondered if you might tell us just a little bit about these books in general, because I feel like they were probably pretty popular and interesting at the time.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, they were actually published by, they're called Gowans art books, but they were published by Gowans and Gray. So if there was a father and son team, there was someone else called Gray as well in the picture. I couldn't tell you who that was. And they published these books, a small format, 6 inches by 4 inches. There's one with Vermeer on the front. With 60 black and white photographs in each and very little text. There's no introduction. You just go through them, 60 paintings with some very minimum details at the bottom of the page. And these were published in Scotland and England, but then they were popular over the whole of Europe, and some of them have at the back the details for the different distributors in different countries. They were very cheap and very early as well for such good quality photographs to be distributed that widely for people all over Europe and further afield if you could get them in America or other countries. Yes, I remember I saw distributors in India and other places. So you could get them all around the world. The equivalent of the internet revolution of the time. They were published the first time around, they were published between 1904 and 1914, when production was broken off by the First World War. And they had plans to publish more at the time. They got as far as 52 volumes first time round. These were re-edited. There were revised versions with slightly different pictures. And there were versions in English and French too. And going back to the quality of the photographs, Walter Benjamin who has written the most influential study of the age of mechanical reproduction and the revolution that brought to the art world and beyond. And he really placed the beginning around 1904. So these were right at the forefront, at the avant-garde of spreading high quality pictures.
Now, this set was obviously published widely, as you say, published in a couple of languages, distributed, outside of the British Isles where it originated. Were these books unique in any way, or was this a popular type of book at the time to kind of be spreading art to the masses?
Yeah, as far as I can tell, these were the first, but they were widely copied. I've got a few here that look almost identical. And these were ones published in Brussels, in Belgium. And these, for example, would have already been published. These would have been available when Dalí visited Brussels in 1926 with his aunt and sister. So he had the chance to buy other volumes beyond the 52 that Gowans and Gray had published. This isn't, well, a lot of this is speculation, but there are good reasons to believe that Dalí also collected some of the other editions. Should say just briefly too, I'll also say that apart from the 52 in the Gowans art masterpieces of art collection, they also started to publish 19th century artists.
Mm-hmm.
And here are some, but the most interesting detail here is that if Dalí also collected these, then he also had a collection of pre-Raphaelite artists in his collection. And Meissonier is also one of them. So it's possible that he had amongst his Gowans books pictures by Meissonier, who was later one of his favorite artists, and came back into his art much later on. But going back to the start of his interest in art, this is a magazine that Dalí was involved with. Some of his friends published while he was still at school. He was around 14, 15.
Mm-hmm.
They produced 6 editions, and this is his page on El Greco.
Okay.
Now, El Greco is one of the artists who, and I'll put up the, oh no. Well, why can't I move on to my next slide? Now I can. So I'll just put up the list there of the 52 that were published.
Wow.
One artist that is not there, and there are important lacunae there. Michelangelo, for example, Leonardo da Vinci is not there. El Greco is not there. And there are some artists there that you think, who are these? Were these really interesting at the time? Shows you how tastes change. But this is a volume on El Greco that was published by Edición Tomás, El Arte en España, and it's exactly the same format. So this is a good example of how this format, this way of publishing books, spread. And amongst them are the 2 illustrations that Dalí used in his Studium article. So that is strong evidence that very early on, Dalí also had other editions other than the Gowans and Gray 52.
Now, just a curiosity that I have before we start talking about Dalí in earnest here, about your own personal collection. So how many of the Gowans have you been able to collect on your own?
Well, I've got, of the 52, I've got about 55, because some, as I say, were reissued in very different versions, and it's impossible to know which Dalí had, because they were some volumes were published in 1904 and republished in a revised version in 1907. So going back that long, it's not possible to know which one he might have had. But there's one example of why that might be relevant we might come to later.
And how does one go about locating these volumes? Do you go to a rare book collector, or you find them on eBay? How does one find these?
Yeah, both of those are how I've found them. I mentioned in the last podcast that I worked at the National Gallery, in London, which is next to a street with fantastic bookshops. So I picked up quite a few of them there just on lunch breaks, and otherwise eBay. And then it's been people selling a good 10, 12 of the books at a time. So I've picked them up cheap. They're still
Very cool.
cheap after all these years.
That's amazing. Now,
But
turning
the other thing
to,
is they're very flimsy, and the ones I have are falling apart. So it's I've probably picked up all the ones that were available.
yeah, well, as you said, I mean, these were maybe published not to be, obviously not to be ephemeral, but also not hardbound in leather, as a, kind of thinking of it as a long-lasting collector's item.
That's right. That's right.
Now turning to Dalí's set, which we've kind of referenced a little bit, where did he get his books? Where did he start collecting these Gowans?
Yeah, he does mention in his account that they were, that worked, that they were his father's books. I put two quotes up here. One is, the first one is from The Secret Life, published in 1942, but obviously he wrote this 1940, 1941, that he brought up to his laundry, which he was using as a studio on the roof of the family home. The whole collection of art Gowans, and that's in the French versions, you can see they're advertised les chefs d'œuvre d'art, no, la collection d'art Gowans. So it's obviously use the French versions. These little monographs, which my father had so prematurely given me as a present, that's not necessarily true. This is from The Secret Life, so you can't trust everything in this first quote. But that they were important to him, that comes across. Just effectively, you can read yourself. But it's interesting here that he talks about, I'm not sure if our faces are over the quote there.
We can see it.
Yeah, good. But then the second quote here is from 20 years earlier, much closer to the time that he was actually looking at these pictures. And this is a different context. This is from a diary. I've put up the version in English translation from Ian Gibbon's book. The Gowans collection is closely linked to my childhood from a very early age. I remember the collection in our home, used to look at the reproductions with positive delight. I adored Rubens's sensual nudes and the Flemish domestic scenes. Now, the Flemish domestic scenes, that's Gabriel Metzu, Jan Steen, and a few others. You can see what he took from them. I'm not going to be using any examples. It's a very general thing, but the domestic scenes, there's a dialogue in them of jugs and bread and a lot of hidden, well, not hidden, hidden to us, but accepted meanings at the time. So, but the mention of Rubens' sensual nudes is interesting because the volume on Rubens in the two editions that I've got, there are very few nudes. So why he picked up on that, and whether he thought the 3 or 4 examples of nudes that there are made that much of an impression on him is quite surprising. Today, I sometimes have to make an effort to separate out a real lived incident from one of these reproductions. And there, I think he's thinking about these Flemish domestic scenes. And he writes this in, or he writes about the books in The Secret Life in connection with these memories at home of pressing a crutch into a melon, and really that's him building on his fantasies of these domestic scenes. That probably didn't happen, but you can picture it in these domestic scenes in the Gowans books.
Yeah, that's the fun thing about Dalí is you always have to kind of guess when
Yeah.
you know, how far can I stretch this? But I thought it was interesting here in both of these quotes. The nudes get mentioned, so clearly nudes made an impression.
Yeah. Well, again, we're talking about the early 1900s in Catholic Spain. So he probably didn't, a lot of people probably didn't get to see that many nudes apart from in these books.
Exactly.
But it's also interesting, the artists that he does mention here aren't the ones that you'd think had made an impression on, or that they're not the ones that you find in the Gowans collection that were important to him later on.
Mm-hmm.
The ones he mentions here, Tenier, Rubens, Watteau, they're surprising examples.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess let's look at some examples. How did Dalí, how did these books impact him? How did they impact his life, his art?
Yeah. I'm going to start with this one. This is an early example, and I don't know if you've ever looked at the self-portrait with Raphaelesque neck, the painting, and wondered what makes that Raphaelesque. And I think the answer there is on the cover to the Gowans book. So that's something that's something he'll have seen thousands of times when he decided that his portrait looked as if it had a Raphaelesque neck.
Yeah, that's really cool. I've seen in isolation that painting many times, but I've never seen it side by side with the cover of the Gowans.
This one is a nice example. If you look at the Gowans illustration on the left and look at the headless body at the bottom,
Mm-hmm.
there's strange stuff going around where the head is, sort of the neck, where it's the head's been chopped off there, and it's hard to tell here. And this is much larger than the illustration as you see it in the book, which is about maybe 4 inches tall. But it looks like, is it vegetation? Is it a swarm of flies around the head? But that's one painting that Dalí knew well, and I think that scene at the bottom would have impacted him.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
He knew that painting well before he traveled to Belgium with his sister and aunt, and saw the original, which is on the right there, which is 10 feet 8 inches by 6 feet in full color. So the difference between the picture that he knew and then seeing that in the flesh is an example of another type of impact that these books had, of training him to know these small black and white reproductions, and the impact that led to when he saw the real thing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's one. And then that scene at the bottom, you can also see where that could have influenced the paintings he did following that trip to Belgium around 27,
Mm-hmm.
1926, 27, and going on with the flies and the rotten donkey that comes up.
Absolutely. Do you think that, you know, this is really interesting, the difference between the size the illustration appears in the book and then obviously what it's like in real life? It reminds me of, you know, the Dalí has paintings that are so vastly different in scale. Mm-hmm. As well. He has these big masterworks, but he also loved to paint these just tiny little scenes, but they're so perfect and sometimes so incredibly detailed. I wonder if that was some influence also by, you know, this idea of how much gets packed into these little tiny illustrations.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And then him calling them hand-painted color photography, mm-hmm. dreams, when he started developing his surrealism. So I think so, yeah. That contrast that he saw between these, and El Greco So we've, as far as I'm concerned, I've established that he had this tiny El Greco in black and white before he went on a trip, again with his sister and mother, when they first went to Madrid and visited the Escorial, and his sister gives an account of him seeing El Grecos in the flesh for the first time and just falling backwards. The impact of seeing everything on that scale. So yes, exactly as you put it, he played with that contrast between tiny images and huge ones.
Very cool.
Yeah, here are a couple of random favorite examples. On the right, Holbein's Ambassadors, just to establish that it's well known that the anamorphic skull was something that was that he used a lot in paintings of the early 1930s. And this is just to establish that he did know it. He knew the painting well from his Gowans collection. But it's used in the same period of his surrealism as extended loaves of bread. It's in a dialogue with them. And then we could talk about the meaning of skulls and bread that he'd taken from religious art. For example, hermits out in the desert, St. Paul and St. Jerome and St. Anthony, with a loaf of bread and a skull. There's a dialogue already there in religious art. But on the left, this I like this example, Domenico Veneziano, head of a monk. Again, we're looking at an illustration that's blown up. In the original, it's even smaller, it's in black and white, and it's a strange image because if you don't know the context, and as I say, there's very little text at the bottom, what is it he's got on his head? To me, I can imagine Dalí seeing that as a loaf of baguette, a loaf of bread balanced on a head, which is something that comes up supposedly randomly in his surrealist object and other paintings when there is a similar loaf of bread balanced across people's heads.
Yeah, absolutely. We just installed a retrospective bust of a woman.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting. As you say, maybe he saw this. Obviously, you don't consciously think about all of these things that you're taking in, and then somehow that image comes up again and it seems new because it's been remixed with other things in your mind now. Yeah, very cool.
Yeah. And it's a nice play between all the meaning that we see in the ambassadors on the right there, all the meaning of every object between them, the dialogue there, and the wider meanings of the anamorphic skull, and something as amusing as a loaf of bread balanced on a head on the left. I think that gives a good idea of the balance that's at play in Dalí's surrealist works. Here again, another example, he does mention Ingres, and it's no surprise, everyone knows that Ingres was one of his most important painters in the early 20s, especially, although he continued to use his paintings as models later on. But there's a double page spread from Ingres with Roger rescuing Angelica, two versions there. And that is an influence on this painting on the right here, Gradiva, 1931. So a lot of the influence and the examples that I'm going to be taking up are from ones we've seen already from 1926, 1927, which was a period when he returned from this trip to Paris and Belgium, shut himself away in his studio in Cadaqués, either with the Gowans books with him or with them fresh in his mind from Figueras passing through. And it's then that he used these images. So I'm pretty sure that he had them with him in Calaques.
Mm-hmm.
There's Botticelli he used, as well as several sculptures in those 1926-27 painting. That period when he was fumbling, looking for a style, really. And then 1929, when he did find it, when he returned again from Paris, and did this series of paintings from 1929 to 1931 and beyond, but especially that first period, 1929 to 30. Then you see a lot of these images that are in the Gowans books in these paintings. So there's one example. Here's another one that that has been recognized before, the influence of these Abraham and Isaac paintings on the William Tell story, which is a similar story of a father sacrificing his son or threatening to sacrifice his son. So Dalí picked up on the secular myth of William Tell, but it's something that had been explored in paintings in religious art. And I think this example from Andrea del Sarto is the one that Dalí is looking at there. I think you can see the formal similarities, the knee resting on the plinth.
Yeah, so this is like art historical detective work.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And especially as you say, the body positioning, that's very provocative for the correspondence.
Yeah. Again, from 1929, this first flurry of activity when he'd returned from Paris, when he'd met a lot of the surrealists, seen a lot of new art, and was now convinced by surrealism, which he hadn't been previously. 26, 27, he was still not sure of what he would be doing within surrealism. The image at the left, at the top left there, Paolo Cello, this is from a series of illustrations. There, I think, frescoes in the original, and there are 6 of them, 6 vignettes in this story of the Jew and the host. So we'll come back to the host later, but this story is illustrated by Uccello here in this very strange format. And at lower right there, we've got a very strange composition by Dalí as well. These figure looking into a doorway, and these 2 walls with a perspective that doesn't quite work in the same way that Paolo Cello's doesn't at the top. But more proof that he was looking at just this series of Paolo Cello's is the painting Profanation of the Host, which he did. On the left, that's a detail of one of the following paintings to the ones on the previous page of the story of the Jew and the host. And there we see an image. I've reproduced it from a photograph of the original in color, just so that we can see it a little clearer, because the original is so tiny in the black and white in the Gowans that you can imagine Dalí would nearly have needed a magnifying glass to see this image. But that, I think it's been recognized elsewhere, is the origin to Dalí's Profanation of the Host on the right there.
Yeah, that is yeah, that's very interesting. I looked at that painting 1,000 times here. And it's interesting to see it now in juxtaposition with this. And so it's like he's taking, obviously he's not really taking the content necessarily of the paintings, but a lot of times it's more the composition or the concept, you know, these two
Right.
heads here in, you know, opposition. It's fascinating.
Especially with he became reconciled with religious meaning and yeah, the genuine original meaning of religious art later on. But this specifically in 1929, he was trying to shock as well. So there he's concentrating on the figure there spitting into the host. In Uccello's paintings, it's a Jew that has been wrongly accused of profaning the host, and the story is of them getting rounded up and executed, burnt at the stake. But as you say, that's not what his interest is in these. It's the story of profaning the host that he was concentrating on. We're trying to put it. And of course, this is also in the context of him using Freudian interpretations. So that's that we take that for granted looking at these. So you know, I'm pointing out where he got some of the images from, but obviously a lot of the time what he is doing is trying to get across surrealist ideas and Freudian interpretations and things, but he's using images from, or he's going through these books and getting ideas. I could use that, I could use that. And as you say, not necessarily for their genuine meaning. Again, this I've reproduced in color, and even then it's not a very good reproduction here. It's not very clear. But this story is interesting in its wider context. And here the religious meanings of the original are interesting. I've looked at Dalí's development through his period in terms of his focus on the self. So this, in my thesis, I wrote about the early period of his interest in Saint Sebastian. Then the focus is on the body of flesh, the mortal body, and so on. Let's not get too far into that. Then I look at his surrealist period, or what's genuinely accepted as his surrealist period between 1929 and 1939, in terms of Saint Jerome and him depicting the self as a thinking entity. So Saint Jerome is something that he used, or the iconography of Saint Jerome that he used in his surrealist paintings. Then that's when the lion's head and the skull and a smooth stone, a desert landscape, ink quills. There are lots of elements from the iconography of Saint Jerome he uses in this depiction of the self as a thinking person. So this is a standard type of painting that this Dürer is an example of a sacra conversazione. And it's often the Madonna and Child at center and surrounded by representative saints of some sort. And it's quite typical to have Saint Sebastian on the right there. This is Saint Anthony on the left, but often it's Saint Jerome. But in both cases, it's a similar area. There are similar meanings behind those saints. And then in the late third period, Dalí was reconciled, and then you can think of the center panel as being his focus of interest. and then its transcendence of the mortal flesh and the limited mind, should we say. Now there on the left is a detail from the left-hand panel as it's reproduced in Gowans, but again, blown up here, much smaller in the original Gowans book. And that for me is the source of this lion's head from The Great Masturbator on the right.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we're looking at 1929, when it seems to me Dalí was flicking through the Gowans books, looking for images that he could use to represent Freudian ideas.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, I feel like it's very consonant with, I guess, the work of surrealism. You know, it's about dislocation, these strange juxtapositions. So it almost seems right to take this image out of a painting, which has absolutely nothing to do with kind of what he's trying to transmit, and then now resituate it in this Freudian context. That's very enlightening about his process.
And then it works again on another step back to think of the Freudian origins to the religious imagery in the first place. So how artists developed a certain iconography of a certain saint.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And here is another example. Again, on the left, there's a color reproduction. But the same painting is in the Gowans books. And there we have Christ in the pose that Dalí used for Christ of St. John of the Cross. And what's interesting here is that it's well known, it's quite well known, it's been studied, the development of this pose and the basis in the Christ drawn by St. John, mm-hmm. which isn't exactly the same as how Jesus, what's his name, Dalí depicted him. Mm-hmm. But he did know a Christ painted in that pose from his Gowans books. And there, it's within a sort of Sacra Conversazione milieu with Saint Jerome, with his lion at his feet, and two female saints, which I forget their names, but they were real figures that helped Saint Jerome or that were close to him.
Now that you said that earlier, as I look at the female saints here, I can only see their halos as bread.
I was just about to mention that. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Now this pose, it's almost like it almost looks as if he took it and he made it more extreme.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In the Castagno, you can still see, part of the facial view of the Christ figure. And then, from the St. John of the Cross, I mean, the view is fully then looking down on top of the head. So it's like he took it and pushed it to the extreme.
Yeah. There's a book by Ignacio Gómez del Llano about Dalí, and it's based on his conversations with Dalí. And he mentions this, and I haven't found it published anywhere else, but he mentions that they had mentioned the Castagno. They had mentioned this painting in a conversation. So that's as much of a recognition that I've been able to find by Dalí that he did use this painting, or that he was aware of the similarity. That's something I've got to chase up. I think I've come to the end now of the, yeah, look at that.
Excellent.
Those were the slides I prepared, but that's a little taster of what I've found.
Well, I think that you have now whet everyone's appetite for going out and finding some of these volumes ourselves. I think, I'm very excited by this kind of detective work aspect of it. I said, well, I need to go into eBay and see if I can find some of these volumes and start doing a little bit of thinking about what does this image bring to mind for me? What is familiar about this to me, so I can see that in Dalí's work.
Set up a race now with the foundation in Figueras, see which archive can build up the biggest collection quickest.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing this. I think it just gives you another aspect of Dalí's development and his relationship to other art and other artists. I found it very enlightening. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Awesome. And thank you also to our viewers for tuning in, and be sure to catch the next episode on YouTube or on our Facebook channel. See you later. Okay, press stop record.